how can one write about the Holocaust, about the Crusades, about 9/11, about colonial oppression? These are all examples of the disaster. And in Maurice Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster, he wants to talk about the implications of moments like these that go beyond a single moment, that go beyond our discrete capacities for our systems to talk about them, in terms of history, in terms of language, in terms of ideology, and the way that writing, as a result, must become not only about disaster, but disastrous itself. And this is a really important way to approach and understand James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. Its very syntax, grammar, and diction are disastrous, but also the content that it discusses, the prevailing predilections and concerns of Finnegans Wake are the disaster. Things like the crime of HCE and the subtle undertones here of incest and rape. These are very central disasters around which Finnegans Wake perambulates and tries to wrap its head around, tries to wrap its page around. And I want to look at Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster and look at some key passages which help us understand the way that the disaster is negotiated in Finnegans Wake. Because one of the important things about the disaster for Blanchot is that it does entail that we are negotiating categories and we are deconstructing and fragmenting categories precisely because the disaster escapes categorization or representation. Any attempt to reduce it to anything other than the singularity and the gravity of its happening causes it to collapse into a sort of absurdity. How can one really talk about, grasp, and articulate something like the Holocaust, which is really the chief disaster that Blanchot is talking about here? But how might we also talk about the way that Ireland has been affected by colonial oppression, or the way that women have been subjugated by hierarchy and by patriarchy? These are concerns of Finnegans Wake that oftentimes are brewing not very far below the surface, and Blanchot shows how systems try to co-opt, try to absorb disasters and make it work for their own gains. And one of the things about the disaster that really puzzles and intrigues Blanchot is the way that one cannot respond to disaster with renunciation. One must respond with a passivity and a receptivity, which allows the disaster to speak on its own terms. But this is the great problem, is that the disaster speaks with such a singular voice that it is always exploding any one voice. It always needs more voices in order to articulate itself. It always affects more than one person, more than one moment, echoing out throughout history and really troubling the systems which caused it in the first place. Think about the fact that the Holocaust in many ways is the apex of Enlightenment rationality. The Holocaust was caused by the eugenics discourse, which co-opted scientific reasoning, taking it to a disastrous and extremely terrifying conclusion. The idea of nationalism, too, led to the Holocaust, to this idea of the nation state as authorizing certain persons' existence and also their extermination. So we can see that very quickly we're kind of congealing a lot of different systems which are taken to disastrous conclusions precisely because the disaster shows the internal limitations and contradictions within a system that cannot be wrested or co-opted by a system without internally fracturing and fragmenting it. Therefore, we can see why Blanchot's writings about the disaster are so important for postmodern thought, because postmodernism and deconstruction is trying to radically subvert hierarchies which are assumed to be natural, eternal, and universal, exploding systems from the inside by showing the gaps that serve as the foundation for what is supposedly the ground of these systems. Therefore, we show the groundlessness and the perambulating, wandering, nomadic nature of all systems. This is, of course, what it feels like to read Finnegans Wake, to be a nomad in one's own tongue, for one picks up a book that gives the illusion of being written in English, but quickly is seen to be well beyond English in terms of diction, in terms of syntax, in terms of idiom, in terms of the voices that are speaking. It seems to speak to a trans-historical, trans-linguistic, trans-cultural, trans-ideological concatenation of systems which resist being reduced to something essential, to ideas of justice, or value, or truth. And this is the real radical thing that Blanchot sees disaster as doing. Disaster, being beyond co-optation and representation, challenges all systems in a way that need not necessarily be celebrated or renounced, for either one of those plays into a dialectical reasoning which Blanchot wants to resist. In a sort of Heideggerian way, he wants to accept, or at least learn to cope with, disaster through a passivity and a receptivity that allows it to be and to show itself forth in its splendor and its horror, depending on, what actor you are in relation to this disaster. And it can help us understand why Finnegans Wake is written the way it is. The reason that it is a dream, the reason that it is Joyce's night book, the reason it seems to be concerned a lot with male figures attacking female figures. Why is all of this so important for Finnegans Wake? That's what we're going to be getting into in this lecture, discussing some key passages in Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster. The disaster often leaves us silent as a result. We have no words by which to express what the disaster has done to and for us. And this silence is best understood and reacted to through a passivity that allows for the unrepresentable to show itself forth for Blanchot. Blanchot says, "I would speak not of thought that is passive, but would evoke rather a passive that is thought, an always already past of thought, that which in thought cannot make itself present, or enter into presence, and is still less able to be represented, or to constitute itself as a basis for a representation. Of this passive, nothing else can be said except that it forbids all presence of thought, all power to conduct thought as far as presence, as far as being. This is not to say, though, that it confines thought to a preserve, a retreat outside of presence. Rather, it leaves thought be, close, with the closeness of distance, the closeness of the other, the thought of the other as thought. The other as thought is what Finnegans Wake is constantly evoking. The idea that thought is always already other, comes to us from an outside which we harbor within ourselves, the alterity and the difference of the communities we're in, the cultural and historical moment we are in. And this is attempted to be covered over with the universality of language or nation or ethnicity. And yet, disaster shows forth the gaps that can only be responded to with the silence, which is the before of language, which Finnegans Wake is constantly trying to write. Finnegans Wake is constantly reaching into an unlocable past to try to account for how language came to be the way it is. And yet, this is also an ahistorical understanding of language, where language resists the reduction to any teleological development. It did not come from one definite point and develop dialectically, precisely to the point that it is now. Instead, language was always already multiple, springing from the multiplicity of the real, from the radical inability to represent in one line, in one gesture, what the world is. Therefore, there's something radically excessive about language and about reality that the disaster is. Blanchot says, when all is said, what remains to be said is the disaster. Ruin of words, demise writing, faintness faintly murmuring. What remains without remains, the fragmentary. Think about the remains in Finnegans' wake. The refuse, the dust or the dirt. This is the very substance of Finnegans' wake, for it does radical violence to the idea of any self-subsisting substance itself. It shows that everything is always already constituted by cracks and by the low, that there is no such thing as the absolute, but there is only the relative crumbling of history, of identity, of narrative. And what do we have left over? What is the excess that cannot be accounted for within narrative or grammar? That is the disaster. That is the reality of malapropisms that Joyce wants to speak to. Or these slips that we can't quite take account of that seem fortuitous or that seem prophetic. Joyce always wants to team on what are the implications of those gaps and those excesses. They could be seen as something transcendent, this would be the prophetic, or on the other hand, they can be something absurd, farcical, right? Something of very little eternal consequence. And maybe it can be both of these at once, or neither, some third thing. This is what we get of the murmuring that we get, for example, at the end of Finnegans' wake, when ALP, or Issy, says, "Memor me," which is remember me, or memory me, or more me, but also it is murmuring me. This is the attempt at the end of the life of a system to articulate itself in a language which is fragmenting. And therefore, what is in between the lines, or what is beyond the lines of the text? Think about the after of Finnegans' wake, after page 628, before you go back to page 3 to begin Finnegans' wake anew. What happens there? What does that silence, that space, that gap, which every time we get to the end of Finnegans' wake, we must pass over in order to get back to page 3. What would it mean to inhabit that space? What would it mean to try to articulate the implications of the rest of page 628 that is blank? Or the indentation on page 3 of Finnegans' wake, before River Run. What is the implication of that space? Who is trying to speak in that space? Well, really all of the rest of Finnegans' wake is an attempt to look at the microdynamics of that silence. A silence which is not therefore non-existent. It is present. From the very beginning of Finnegans' wake, we have not River Run, but we have the blank space inhabited by that indentation before we read River Run, which we encounter first. And that silence, that void, as Joyce calls it, a rude breathing on the void of to be. That is our ground, which is precisely the groundlessness of history. And this has important implications for thinking about the role of dream in Finnegans' wake. Because Finnegans' wake has often been compared to Freud's dream analyses, where he seeks to find some sort of symbolic ground to dreams, right? Locating them in certain structures like the Oedipus complex, and linking the manifest content, what the dreamer dreams, to the latent content, what it represents, what it really is. But Finnegans Wake wants to resist this essentializing language and this essentializing theory, and in its place, learn to accept night and dreams for themselves without having to reduce them to something that they really are. Therefore, this is an anti-Platonic understanding of dreams, of darkness, of images, of appearances. It's a phenomenology that does not assume that images are something secondary to the reality which they represent, and therefore Finnegans Wake is anti-representation. There is not something behind the curtain of the dream of Finnegans Wake. It is merely the surface play of these appearances, and any of the traces of reality which we have are only reality as trace, as a remainder that cannot be co-opted. And this can often be the remainder of something scary. For example, there is great textual evidence in Finnegans Wake to support the idea that the real crime that HCE has done is that he has raped his daughter, Issy. And we only get this as traces of the son's interaction with his sister, Issy. He gives a sermon in Book 3 of Finnegans Wake, which is littered with suggestiveness, with sexual affronts, and also violence and danger directed towards Issy, which seems to imply that this is the remnants, the cinders of the father's sullying of the daughter through rape. So what would it look like to encounter something like rape, a disaster par excellence that cannot be co-opted by patriarchal language, by the system that Western literature depends on? Well, this would be a dream which is without end, waking without beginning. Neither one nor the other ever reaches itself. Only dialectical language relates them to each other in view of a truth. Right? So the dialectical language would be the one who wants to approach Finnegans Wake and try to systematize and discretize the crime and say what it really is. And I'm not saying that the crime really is rape. I'm saying that one of the suggestive possibilities, one of the intractable and indissoluble permutations of Finnegans Wake suggests rape. And particular, not suggests the content and the experience of the rape, but the way that the system, the way that patriarchy, the way that men, the way that religion reacts to and tries to co-opt rape. Because one of the ways that rape gets talked about in Finnegans Wake is its attempted justification by Sean. This is how HCE/Sean tries to make amends for this rape under the auspices of a rationalized incest. Using fascist rhetoric, Sean in Book 3 tries to excuse this rape by saying that because it's incest, it is actually an attempt to maintain his purity, because he's keeping sex within the family, and therefore he's not tainting his race with difference or with the other. Of course, we can see that this is totally not true, because he is assailing an other, which under the family model is subsumed into a sameness under the father, right? The daughter is a function of the patriarchal economy of the family, only has value insofar as she is objectified and of use to the father, and of the of the son too, because the son is part of this patriarchal lineage who is going to take up the property of the father. So in this way, we see attempts by the system to co-opt the excess and attempts to confront it. But it doesn't actually confront it, right? It tries to make excuses for it, but it's not going to give us rape in its lurid, uncomfortable, and detrimental details. And it's not going to let Issy speak for herself. Therefore, the only time that Issy is really trying to speak for herself is when she's a peripheral figure At the very end of Finnegans Wake, and hence belatedly, she's like the owl of Minerva here, spreading her wings at dusk and attempting, some would say, helplessly, to fly away and to fly by the nets of religion and of patriarchy that Stephen talks about at the end of A Portrait of the Artist. But also we have her marginal annotations in Book 2.2, the Night Lessons chapter. There's a very long letter written by the childish Issy, who is attempting to come to the knowledge of the crimes of the father and of the way it is being inherited actively by the sons through their coming to the sexual knowledge of the female through the mother. Therefore, it's very Oedipal in the Night Lessons chapter. And she attempts to write the results of that, one of them being her thoughts about suicide. So this affects Issy in a very significant manner. It leaves her in shambles. And she's constantly trying to pick up the pieces, nonetheless, as is ALP, the mother, who is trying to pick up the pieces for the father of all the broken history that patriarchal institutions represent in Finnegans Wake. From the very beginning, we are discussing wars, we're discussing religious strife, we're discussing ideological strife, all tainted in the language of truth, of history, of rationality, of these concepts which have been historically theorized as essentially male. And what Finnegans Wake does is a sort of feminist deconstruction of truth, of history, of rationality, showing their gaps through the dream, through the waking that is without beginning, which is to say, always in the process of waking up, of coming to the truth. And coming, of course, has sexual implications that Joyce will play on throughout Finnegans Wake. Therefore, we have a real dialectic between clarity and obscurity that Joyce wants to show as intractable when we are talking about the disaster. Blanchot says, when all is obscured, there reigns the clarity without light which certain utterances foretell. A lot of very choice words here from Blanchot. Foretelling, of course, has the prophetical implication, right? That certain things herald a future to come, perhaps even invite and invoke and create that future through the very utterance itself, that the truth does not precede the utterance which authorizes that event, which is to be ushered in through the telling. And every telling has a tailing, we've been told by Joyce. Every telling of the truth is spun by the teller of a tale, of a fiction, of a myth, of a narrative, of an attempt to co-opt and wrest the impossible singularity of reality and turn it into history, which of course is a political and ideological concept. An attempt to systematize reality, discretize it, and therefore subsume it under narratives such as patriarchy or Christian domination and eschatology. But what happens when we enter the land of obscurity, the night and the dream and the unconscious? Well, now we see a fragmentary deconstruction of clarity, the likes of which we see in one of Joyce's more well-known portmanteau words, clear obscure. Clear obscure is a perfect way to seek clarity through obscurity, and also the obscurity always laden within clarity, the intractable obscurity and opacity of the disaster, which refuses to be reduced to one voice, to one author or authorization. Therefore, beneath any of the master narratives or any of the master systems that Finnegans Wake utilizes, there is always the gaps which indict it. And what is interesting about Finnegans Wake is that the night is both a terrorizer, a evil deceiver, and also a jestful, playful, jocular Joyce. Both of these exist at the same time for we're talking about very serious events like violence. And yet at the same time, we're talking about inconsequential verbal mishaps, random stories from various historical moments. Blanchot says, wakefulness is without beginning or end. To wake is neutral. I do not wake. Someone does. The night does. Always and incessantly, hollowing the night out into the other night where there can be no question of sleeping. There is no waking save at night. Night is foreign to the vigilance which is exercised, carried out, and which conveys lucid reason toward what it must maintain in reflection, in the preservation, that is, of its own identity. Wakefulness is estrangement. It does not waken, as if emerging from a sleep that would precede it. Yet it reawakens, constant and instant return to the immobility of the wake. Something wakes. Something keeps watch without lying in wait or spying. The disaster watches. Right? So there's something sinister about the way that he's talking about disaster and about waking here, which really brings to the fore the processual nature of Finnegans Wake, right? That we are always in the wake of, which is to say, belatedly encountering a process of waking, which we are always sort of babbling through the terms of, babbling in the terms of. We're always trying to speak a language which is without beginning or end, a book which is without beginning or end. And this is an intractable difficulty about Finnegans Wake, but it's not so different from everyday life now, is it? For we cannot locate our beginning, nor can we anticipate our end outside of precisely this mode of anticipation or anxiety, which in Finnegans Wake becomes a sort of festering neurosis, an obsession over the littlest details, which is really a sort of obsessive compulsion over the impossibility of truth, of certainty. Instead, we have a neutral waking where I do not maintain myself. I am shot through with holes like Buckley shooting the Russian general. What we are left behind with is a sort of empty husk where there is no waking save that which occurs in the lucidness of the night, of the clarity. Think of like a dream that you awaken from and you simply can't articulate it to anyone, and yet it was so clear. A proper clear-obscure, as Joyce would put it. And we have no way to get it out of our minds. It stays and it lingers. This sort of in-between of the remnants and traces of the dream, that is much what it feels like to read Finnegans Wake. It's like when you wake up and you knew you had a dream, but you can barely remember what it was. Maybe you can pick out some choice details or some words or some feelings or sensations. Finnegans Wake, we might say, as Blanchot puts it, lets the light of the dream play. Think about light in a room, just kind of dancing and bouncing around aimlessly. It is the touch of the powerless infinite, exposure to the other of the night, where thought renounces the vigor of vigilance, gives up worldly clear-sightedness, perspicacious mastery, in order to deliver itself to the limitless deferral of insomnia, the wake that does not waken, nocturnal intensity. And there is a sort of palpability and intensity in Finnegans Wake that is beyond explication, that you have to experience for yourself. It is encounter with an other which you can't quite put your finger on, and that is the real power of the other, is that it haunts us as that which, because of it, we are dissembled, set asunder, and disghosted, as Joyce puts it, which is to say, disgusted with that which we cannot disghost, which we cannot extricate from its ghostly quality. I'm reminded of the line in Finnegans Wake, that ideal reader suffering from an ideal insomnia. The supposedly ideal reader is someone steeped in neuroses, in maladaptive behaviors and conditions, and yet who is constantly exposed to the other of the night, which is themselves. That which the waking world of the busyness of work and capitalism would try to suppress, and yet in the night cannot be suppressed, for the unconscious is wanton and constantly articulating itself as a babbling rumor. What's interesting about Finnegans Wake is the way that it maintains a lot of the syntactical qualities of the stream of consciousness technique, which he developed throughout his oeuvre. But now it has been turned into a radically polyvocal stream of consciousnesses, where there is no longer any discrete consciousness to ground Finnegans Wake. In fact, the real problem for HCE is that he can't seem to speak for himself. He can only seem to speak for his community, for posterity, for his descendants, for a history he can't quite understand, for an unconscious and desires and crimes that he can't quite locate. Therefore, Blanchot says, where I am dreaming, something wakes. A vigilance which is the unexpectedness of the dream, and where in fact there keeps watch, in a present without duration, a presence without subject, the unpresence to which no being ever accedes, and whose grammatical formulation would be a third person. This third person is the other who speaks in Finnegans Wake. Not the subject or the object, but beyond this dualism. Something which cannot be represented, which speaks in the spaces between the lines, speaks in the silences which scream to us. It is vigilant, constantly in the process of waking and erupting, and hence the real vitality of the language of Finnegans Wake, where grammar never accedes to one system, where history never gives us a singular narrative line. Instead, we get a present without duration, right? Without something that we can quite take account of by saying everything in Finnegans Wake happens between this time and this time, or between this day and this day, or on this day. Some might say that Finnegans Wake happens in the year 1132. Wim van Mierlo has said this, for example. But in a way you could say, never takes place. Finnegans Wake does damage to the idea of place, and indeed Blanchot says that the disaster does damage to the idea of place. It's never a one and done, something that has taken place and no longer is taking place. It is always already taking our place, acting in our stead. Therefore, the writing of the disaster, through the ambiguity of the word of, is both writing about the disaster, but also the writing of the disaster, which is to say from or by, authorized by a disaster, which really we could see this as the conclusion of Joyce's life. A disaster which speaks in his stead and which does death to the idea of the author. Therefore, of course, Finnegans Wake is in many ways often explicitly acceding to the idea of the death of the author. Because what do we have in place of the author? The disaster which authorizes nothing but its alterity. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helpful for thinking about these ideas. There's much more that I could talk about in this book. It's so fruitful, and I really enjoyed reading it and sort of filling it with quotes from Finnegans Wake and different ideas regarding Finnegans Wake. I would highly recommend this if you're interested in post-structuralist theory, in French 20th century thought in Finnegans Wake. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out, helps me purchase the books necessary to bring you all this content. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.